Welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining. My name is Yulia Shinderovich and I work as a senior lecturer at the Wolfson Centre for Young People's Mental Health. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to today's lecture. And to open up, I just want to mention that this lecture is part of the public lecture series that we run here at the Wolfson Centre. The lecture today is recorded. And similarly, the previous talks have been recorded, so you can find them on the channel of the center on YouTube. We'll post the link in the chat as well, so you can catch up on the talks you missed. And the talk today will be just under an hour, so we'll have about 15-20 minutes towards the end of the hour for questions. But as questions come up throughout the talk, you can post them in the Q&A box that you can hopefully see. Post your questions and we'll try and get to as many as we can towards the end of the hour. Now it's my pleasure to introduce our two speakers today, who you can hopefully see on your screens. It's Professor Sarah Skeen and Tatenda Mawoyo. Both of them are based at the Institute for Life Course Health Research at the University of Stellenbosch. And we'll hear more about the center shortly. And Professor Skeen is also a visiting researcher at the Institute for Social Science Research at the University of Amsterdam. Professor Skeen has led a series of systematic reviews of literature that have informed the World Health Organization's guidelines on interventions for promoting mental health of adolescents and preventing mental health problems. And today we'll hear more about this work and how it has developed into thinking about intervention approaches. So very pleased to have you both, and over to you, Sarah and Tatenda. Thanks so much for your time.
Thanks so much, Julia. It's really lovely to be here, and thank you for the invitation. I'll just start with sharing my screen. Let me know if it doesn't go according to plan. Also, I see that I'm on the webinar twice, but this is the real me here. So it's really great to be here. As Julia said, I'm here with my colleague Tatenda Mawoyo, and we're going to be speaking about some of the work that we do. I'd like to just give you a bit of context about us and who we are. So we have a website, like most websites. I'm sure it probably needs a bit of updating. But basically, we are a research institute. We've been operating kind of in an informal way for about over a decade, but for the last 3 to 4 years, we've become a formal entity at the Stellenbosch University, which is near Cape Town in South Africa. And really what our aim is to become a centre of excellence in child and adolescent mental health and development research. And really, we feel that there's a great need for a Southern-led institution that's focused on this type of work. For the most part, we have worked in South Africa and Lesotho, but we've also worked in a number of other East and Southern African countries, and a little bit, as you'll hear a bit later, in Nepal, and as well as some West African sites. And we specialize mostly in 2 areas. So one is longitudinal studies. So you can see there's a nice photo of a participant from one of our studies with a photograph of himself when he was a baby, when he was first enrolled. And that particular study, we've been tracking the people for 20 years. And we also work a lot on community-based interventions, mainly preventive interventions that we co-create together with participants, with adolescents, with young people, with caregivers, depending on the topic area. So I'll just say up front, you know, we love partners and working with other people. So if anyone's interested in reaching out, please do, and would like to know more about our work. So today, what I really want to do is just take you through some of the work we've done in adolescent promotive and preventive interventions. In our unit, we like to think that we think global, but we act local. So we've had 2 big pieces of work that we've been focusing on for the last few years. I'm going to present it as a bit of a linear journey. In reality, of course, this wasn't totally always quite as linear as this, but there's really 2 big focus areas that we're going to cover today. First of all, I'm going to take you through the Helping Adolescents Thrive initiative. So this is not our initiative, it's the WHO UNICEF initiative, but our institute has contributed to a lot of the work that's gone on for this. And the idea is that basically UNICEF and WHO want to develop responses to promote positive mental health and prevent mental health conditions in adolescents. And I'll go into a bit of detail about that in a second. Then I will hand over to my colleague Tatenda, who will speak to us more about hashtag, which is a study that we've been running in South Africa and Nepal, standing for Health Action in Schools for a Thriving Adolescent Generation. Oh, sorry. There are a number of people, some of whom are in Cardiff, who've contributed to a lot of this work. So I've tried to list everybody here, but hopefully I haven't forgotten anybody. But this is because I'm speaking about so many different pieces of work. Just please be aware there's a massive team behind all of this. It's certainly not just the work of me and Tatenda by any means. So thank you in advance to everybody that's contributed so far. So basically our journey in this space started around 2018 when we were commissioned by WHO to do reviews on promotive interventions for mental health, which I will mention again in a second as part of the guidelines process. And what we did was we did a set of actually 8 different reviews, and we were really interested in the outcomes you can see in the first 4 boxes. So looking for interventions that promoted positive mental health, that prevented mental disorders or symptoms of disorders, prevented risk behaviors, and then also prevented self-harm or suicidal ideation. And we really looked across all kinds of different settings. So schools, community health centers, we looked at digital interventions. We looked at interventions that used a combination of approaches. We also looked at interventions from a big range of professionals and as well as non-professionals and even peer-led programs. And what happened was we used those as I mentioned, there were 8 different reviews that we did, and the difference between them was the population, the target population. So what I'm going to speak to today is really the review on and the work that we've done on universal interventions, but there were also reviews that were done on different targeted populations and 2 different indicated populations as well. So for the university delivered interventions, I'm not going to go into the details of the review for this talk, but I'm very happy to speak to them if anyone's interested. But basically we found that for university delivered interventions for this group, that there were small effect sizes for promoting positive mental health outcomes and for preventing symptoms of depression and anxiety, as well as violent and aggressive behaviors. And there was a very small effect for substance use as well. And then we tried to do some components analysis, and we found that these 7 components on the right were associated with larger effect sizes in at least one of the different formats of the type of interventions that we looked at. And as I mentioned, this first review fed into these WHO guidelines. So you can access this online. This was published in 2020. And there is a very, as I'm sure you would realize, very set process that happens with WHO guidelines. So we fit in a little bit later, but basically there was a WHO steering group that was set up from within WHO. They appointed a guidelines development group, which is an international group of experts, and then an external review group who are the peer reviewers of the process. There's obviously a process of conflicts of interest being declared. And then the guidelines development group will identify which are the key questions. And in this case, they identified 8 questions. They formulate them according to the PICO formulation, looking at the population, what intervention they're interested in, what the comparison group would be, and the outcome. And then we fitted in here, number 6, we were involved in the identification and appraisal and synthesis of the evidence that was available. And then based on what we found, we had a meeting in October 2019. Just every time I see a travel date that was towards the end of 2019, I always think we didn't know what was about to come next. But we had a meeting, actually the meeting was in Cape Town, which I think is quite unusual for these meetings, so it was really nice. And we formulated recommendations based on the review, or we didn't formulate them, the GDG formulated them based on the evidence that we had found. So for universal interventions, this is the recommendation that was made at that meeting and then published subsequently the following year. And that it was that university delivered intervention should be provided for all adolescents. And then based on the reviews and some of the other evidence that was provided, we showed that the interventions did promote positive mental health. They prevented suicidal behavior. That wasn't part of our review. That was a separate piece. Mental disorders such as depression and anxiety, and symptoms, aggressive, disruptive, and oppositional behaviors, and substance use. And then this is the kind of official WHO recommendation, basically, on universal interventions at this point. And you can read more about it in the guidelines document, which is online. So after this had been made, we then started to think a little bit more about what tools would be needed to help countries to think about adolescent mental health, and particularly around adolescent mental health promotion and prevention. So WHO and UNICEF then initiated this toolkit. It's called the Helping Adolescents Thrive Toolkit. It was published in 2021. And what this toolkit does is it takes things a step further. So the interventions that I've just mentioned really fall in the fourth strategy that you can see there, preventive psychosocial interventions for adolescents, including for marginalized groups. But they wanted to think a little bit more broadly as well about the other levels of intervention that would be needed to really promote adolescent mental health in different settings. So this toolkit has got these four strategies laid out quite clearly, and a number of different examples and tools and checklists that can be used to try to guide countries towards developing their approach. So the first strategy is around the implementation and enforcement of laws and policies that promote and protect adolescent mental health. The next strategy is around the environments that adolescents live in. And we have sections on schools, on communities, and also the online environment. And of course, the school environment being very important for some of the presentation we'll be giving in a second. Then there's a strategy around parent and caregiver support, with the ultimate aim being the promotion and protection of adolescent mental health. And then, of course, the psychosocial interventions that I mentioned as well. So this document sort of took things a bit further and gave the whole approach a broader umbrella or structure that countries could work from. Around the same time, I'd just like to add this in because I think a lot of people don't know about this, but there was a comic and teacher guide tool that was also released by UNICEF, leading with WHO partnering. And this is quite a nice, almost sort of little teaching intervention, you could say, that teachers can use in the classroom. It relies on a comic. You can see there, Magnificent May. And it has 3 little lesson plans that come off it, and quite a lot of information for teachers about what they can use if they want to speak about mental health with their class, and some essentials around mental health as well. So you can see that slowly there's this kind of ecosystem of tools being developed around the kind of 4 levels of the Helping Adolescents Thrive initiative. And then something that I'm more involved with at the moment is a caregiver support package. This is being led by UNICEF, and this is currently under development. So the idea is that we're developing an intervention package to support caregivers of adolescents, and particularly with a kind of adolescent mental health view. It's been based partly on evidence reviews that were done for this document on the left, which is a UNICEF programming guidance for parenting of adolescents, along with some other evidence reviews as well. And as a part of the process of developing this document, we were just really struck by how limited the evidence base is for parenting of adolescents support, particularly around mental health, where there haven't been a lot of kind of common threads and lessons that have been brought forward that, you know, to an extent that we can recommend certain approaches. So we tried really hard to bring everything together and to learn from kind of adjacent types of programs such as violence prevention. And the draft of this at the moment consists of 3 skills-based workshops. One is about navigating caregiving in the adolescent years, and it's really focused on trying to help caregivers of adolescents understand what changes in terms of your role as a caregiver, and the fact that you need, you know, where you need to let go and encourage independence, and where adolescents might still need help with regulating certain things. The second is around nurturing your relationship. It's about difficult conversations and listening and communicating with adolescents, and also dealing with conflict. And the third is about supporting your adolescents' mental health. So issues like practicing compassion, promoting their self-esteem, as well as identifying when there's warning signs and what kind of help they might need. So that's currently still under development. And that brings me to Project Hashtag. So this is a logo, I might say, was selected by some of our adolescents, but Tatenda will speak a bit more about this in a second. So around the same time that this was happening, and sort of also around the onset of COVID, we received MRC funding together with some people from Decipher, who obviously are located in Cardiff, to do a feasibility trial of a school-based intervention in South Africa and Nepal. And this project has been developed in line with these priority areas and the principles from the WHO guidelines and the HAT toolkit, and basically has taken place through 2 different phases. The first phase, which Tatenda is going to talk us through both of these. The first phase we call the development phase, and there's been a lot of the formative work around actually creating the intervention content for delivery in schools into low middle income country settings. And then the second phase has been the feasibility trial, where we were trying to ascertain if the intervention was feasible and acceptable to the adolescents themselves, of course, but also to everybody else in the school environment. So I'm going to stop there, and what I'll do is I'll hand over to my colleague, Tatenda, who's going to take us through a little bit of the experiences of running this project with an emphasis on the South African side. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Sarah. And thank you so much for this opportunity to speak to you a little bit about Project Hashtag and the journey that we have gone through. So as Sarah mentioned, Project Hashtag is comprised of two strategies. The first one is thriving environment in schools. And this is basically a school level intervention that has numerous activities. Then the second one is thriving together. And this is a group-based adolescent psychosocial intervention. And in South Africa, we decided to go with grade 8 because this is the first grade in high school. So we thought it would be best placed for the grade 8s. Another thing to mention here is that the reason why we have two components is that in an LMIC context, when priorities shift, single issue interventions are more likely to be crowded out. And therefore, we thought a multi-component approach would be wise. Next slide, Sarah. Thank you. So just to give a brief understanding of the context, I'm just going to speak a little bit about the setting, and I'll look at it from two perspectives. One, the contextual setting, but also the setting regarding COVID. So Project Hashtag was conducted in two countries, South Africa and Nepal, and I'll be dwelling on South Africa. So in South Africa, the site was Khayelitsha, which is the fastest growing and the third largest township in South Africa. It is characterized by high unemployment, and a lot of the students that are, for example, in grade 12 are the first students, they are the first generation to get to grade 12. So for example, 36% of those aged 20 and above have completed grade 12, which is the school living certificate or higher. We also see that there's about 75% that earn 3,200 Rand or less. So this speaks to high levels of poverty and high levels of inequality as well. And then in terms of the intervention actually took place during COVID-19. And to mitigate against some of these risks, schools adopted a rotational approach. So students would, for example, come to school on a Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, and then on a Tuesday and Thursday, they would maybe have activities to do at home. This meant that teachers had numerous extra responsibilities, so it was difficult for them to be the ones to actually facilitate the intervention. So in terms of the development phase, when we were looking at what needs to go into this intervention, we sought some wisdom from adolescents as well as stakeholders that support adolescents. So for instance, we interviewed caregivers, teachers, school management representatives, and NGO representatives. We also had 3 focus groups with adolescents aged 12 to 15. In terms of the findings of this process, we found that some of the protective factors in the school context were the extracurricular activities. So for instance, the soccer or choir, things like that. We found that those were some of the protective factors. And unfortunately, a lot of these activities had to be stopped during COVID. We also found that having a trusting relationship with some adults, be it teaching or non-teaching staff, was also alluded to as a major protective factor in school. Regarding the risk factors, bullying, particularly cyberbullying, was cited as one of the main risk factors in the schools. And it was also mentioned that younger learners are perhaps more vulnerable to that bullying. And this was also another reason why we decided to end up working with the grade 8s. In terms of the considerations for the psychosocial intervention, there was a strong sentiment of the inclusion of assertiveness as well as substance abuse regarding the curriculum. And in terms of facilitators, bilingual facilitators that were non-judgmental were advocated for. As for the facilitators of the intervention, the provision of food was essential. Having fun and engaging activities, particularly for the thriving together, was cited. And also finding ways to help teachers to be more approachable was something that was recommended. As for the barriers of the intervention, transport constraints was something that came up quite strongly in the focus groups and the individual interviews, because a lot of the students have got club transport. So if, for instance, hashtag was going to be facilitated after school, we needed to be mindful of such factors. Now, I'm just going to go through one of the quotations from one of our adolescents. And here they're speaking about the ideal qualities of a facilitator for TT. So someone that is also there, someone older, but a youth, like in late 20s, early 30s, someone who knows about these experiences. So I think from this quote, we see that having life experience was important, but also being relatable to the adolescents was also an essential quality. And from a stakeholder perspective, I'm just going to read one quotation that looked at substance abuse. And this is a view from a school management representative. I remember when I started in my class, the year I started, it was 2016. In my class, I was teaching grade 8. Almost half, but not all of them were reporting each other. So we discovered that more than half a class was using drugs, as they were more than half of class. Mostly it was boys, but it was girls as well. And I think this speaks to the challenge when it comes to substance abuse in the schools. So after this process, we refined the content a little bit, and then we decided to have intervention development groups. And so for the IDGs, we had an adolescent advisory board. So as an institute, we've got an adolescent advisory board, and they give us guidance whenever there is an adolescent-related project or content. But we also sought the perspectives of grade 9 representatives from the 4 schools that we were going to work with. So at this stage, we now had a better understanding of some of the components of the intervention. So for example, with the school action groups, we wanted to find out from the IDGs what they thought about the idea, as well as the composition of the group, best ways to recruit, potential barriers, as well as the frequency of the meetings. And the key findings from this process was that they advocated that all grades should be represented in the SAGs. The external facilitators should be the one to market the idea in a fun and creative way. And then the SAG meetings to perhaps take place on a Friday, as school closes earlier on a Friday. And regarding a school-wide competition, we asked them what they thought about the idea, potential incentives, best ways of marketing, and the support needed from the school staff to make it a success. So they advocated for posters to market, and they supported the idea of having incentives, and they encouraged for us to be a little bit more open when it comes to creative expression. So not only to allow one form. So for example, to have drawing, but to also have poetry, because people have different talents. And in terms of the teacher modules, so for this one, we also sought the perspectives of teachers and school management representatives. And here we wanted to find out, what do they think about the idea? And basically the idea was to support teachers, to have a workshop or sessions with teachers to offer them support. So from an adolescent perspective, we wanted to understand what makes it difficult to relate to teachers, what skills are needed by teachers to connect with adolescents, and ways to engage teachers to make it more successful. And some of the key findings were the importance of teachers being approachable, the importance of teachers building rapport with their students, and the importance of keeping sensitive information confidential. So I'm just going to share a little bit of a story in terms of that. Whilst having this IDG, one of the participants highlighted that he had shared something quite sensitive with a teacher that he trusted. And unfortunately, this issue was then discussed in the staff room. And one day when he was naughty in class, another teacher actually sort of spoke about this issue in public just to embarrass him. So I think this was basically showing the importance of getting teachers to respect sensitive information and actually to keep it confidential. From a teacher perspective, we wanted to find out what they thought about the idea, where would be an ideal venue, and also to get some insight in terms of the stresses regarding their role due to COVID-19. So there was a general appreciation for the willingness to consider teacher well-being. They mentioned that a lot of the activities generally focus only on the students. So they were quite appreciative of the fact that we're also interested in looking at teacher well-being. They advocated for the teacher modules to happen off-site, so not in the school context. And they gave some ideas of their additional responsibilities due to COVID-19. So for example, it would be the screening, the sanitizing. So this limited their break time and added onto an already full plate. So from a research perspective, there were 4 schools that were selected for this study. Once the school agreed to participate, we then conducted baseline. And for the baseline assessments, 235 participants were interviewed. Thereafter, we did randomization. So 2 schools became intervention and the 2 became control. After the intervention, we then had follow-up assessments. And we actually had quite a good follow-up rate, approximately 98%. So we interviewed 231 participants at follow-up. Now, looking at the results of what emerged from this process. So TES, which was the whole school intervention, these were the 3 components that came up. So these were school action groups, and this is student and teacher representatives that would meet on a weekly basis to speak about the school-specific hashtag components in their school and to drive this process forward. We also had mental health awareness, and this was comprised of a launch. And this was basically speaking to each and every staff member and pupil in the school about hashtag. And we did this class by class because we couldn't have it in large gatherings due to COVID-19. We also then spoke to all the people about the mental health awareness competition. And essentially this was about young people speaking to young people about what does mental health mean to them, and perhaps what are the effective coping mechanisms if you're struggling with this. We also had then text messages to caregivers. So for the TT component, which was the psychosocial intervention, after each session, messages were sent to the caregivers so that they could be aware of what the content was and therefore reinforce some of these messages with their children. And the same approach was adopted with the teachers, where text messages were also sent after the teacher modules. So with the teacher modules, we actually adapted material from War Child, and we came up with 3 modules. And the first module was getting to know one another. And some of these teachers perhaps have been working together for such a long time, but we found that this was actually an essential session. So we got them to, for example, have different icebreakers, appreciate each other, and they found this quite useful. We also then looked at understanding stress and self-care. And the idea around this was not to focus more on the theory, but to actually focus on the practical elements and looking at maybe some of the barriers and how they could support each other. And lastly, we looked at tips and tools for teachers to engage meaningfully with adolescents. Now, just in terms of the TES Reflection, so in terms of the SAGs, in both schools, we had about 8 to 10 active members in each SAG. There are obviously more members, but we found that about 8 to 10 of them were really actively involved. And they would meet on a regular basis, and we found that they really drove this process. And I think one of the learnings from this process was that the link teacher or the link teachers that you're assigned to are essential. If they are quite motivated and they find value in the project, they tend to go the extra mile, which makes it a lot easier to maneuver. Then in terms of the competition, in the middle there, you see one of our posters in the school. So we put up this poster and invited people to enter the competition. And we had mixed responses in the different schools. One school had 34 entries, and in the other school, there was only 8 entries. And then the third table there, this just shows the attendance rates for the teacher modules. And I think you can see session 1 and session 2 happened on the same day. And in both schools, you can see that for the second session, which is session 3, there was an increase in terms of their attendance. And one of the things that was cited by the teachers was that it was very practical, and they liked the fact that it was off-site. So we actually had it at a hotel, which they appreciated. And we gave them just small tokens of appreciation. And all of these things went in our favor in terms of them coming back for the other session and finding value in the process. Now, before I go and speak about the TT, I would like to give you an experiential activity. And this is something that we did with the students, and it's basically called the feeling thermometer. And as you can see there, 0 means you're feeling really, really bad, and 10 means you're basically on top of the world. So just to take a moment to see where you are in terms of the feeling thermometer, and perhaps to assign a feeling to that. Okay. We can move on to the next slide. So just to give you an overview of the TT, we had 6 sessions that were conducted on a weekly basis, and it was about 90 minutes for each session. The sessions were co-facilitated by 2 external facilitators, a male and female. And in terms of the components that were covered, the content components that were covered, I think it covered the ones that were cited by Sarah earlier on when she was speaking about the reviews. So we had, for example, emotional regulation, mindfulness, stress management, conflict resolution, assertiveness, problem solving, just to name a few. Now, in terms of the reflection of the TT process, we found that fun and interactive activities were essential. So we would start our sessions with an icebreaker, and just to make sure that the atmosphere is comfortable for the adolescents to engage. And this really worked well for us. Both students and facilitators advocated for parental or caregiver involvement. So earlier on, I said we did send SMSs, but I think the general sentiment was that we could do more in terms of actually engaging parents and caregivers to a greater extent. And again, here, Sarah spoke about the comics. So we actually utilized the comics. So after each session, we would then give the comics that corresponded to that session. And they were actually very well received, and they were found to be a good way to reinforce the key messages. And the materials generally evoked relevant discussion. So for instance, when it comes to assertiveness, we used role plays here, and the adolescents would depict some of the stresses that they were going through, and how difficult sometimes it is to be assertive in certain contexts. From an attendance perspective, about 67% of the participants attended 4 out of 6 sessions. And this is mainly due to COVID, because they would attend the hashtag sessions on the day that they were not in school. So some of them, unfortunately, did not show up on a regular basis. So about 2/3 of them managed to attend 4 out of the 6, at least 4 out of the 6 sessions. So in conclusion, in terms of the next steps, one of the things that we've identified is organizational readiness. And we found that the 2 schools engaged with the project on 2 different levels. And one of the things that we're thinking about right now is looking at ways of perhaps enhancing the levels of readiness of the schools so that they will be able to receive hashtag better, and so that we can see greater impact. We're also still looking at analyzing the data, seeing that it was a feasibility trial. And if that goes well, we'll then determine whether to go for a full trial. And to conclude, I would also just want to thank the facilitators, and the 4 of them are in this picture. It was really a difficult project to navigate, particularly given that it was during COVID and there were many competing priorities. So yeah, I think they really went the extra mile and they really made it a success. Thank you very much. And I hope it was useful. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tatenda and Sarah. What a joyful picture to have at the end of the slides. Thank you so much. I want to thank you for your talk, and also our attendees for being here, and to remind everybody that you can post your questions in the Q&A box, which you can hopefully see somewhere on your screen, or we can also pick them up through the chat if you don't find the Q&A, but I think the Q&A button should be at the bottom of your screens. So please go ahead.
Can I make a couple of comments in the meantime while people are gathering their thoughts? Yeah, I just want to first of all say thank you to Tatenda, because obviously, as you can see, logistically and organizationally and empathetically, this was a difficult project to run. I like to joke that when we publish the first paper, we're going to call it, if you want to run a school climate intervention, don't do it during COVID when all the schools are closed or partially closed, because obviously we had quite ambitious plans, which we weren't able to translate into reality. So this is the kind of pared down version of what we were hoping to do. But I think also it's also a good lesson. I think there's a lot of talk about schools as a platform for mental health services, and I absolutely am totally bought into that. But the reality is that every school, and I'm sure that there's many people that are in the audience who've worked in schools will know this, is its own little universe, and trying to fit programming into each universe separately is extremely challenging, and it was made even more challenging during COVID, where different schools were managing things in different ways. So I think a lot of lessons were learned, and what we'll be doing next is thinking about, there are certainly things that we did which I would consider to be less scalable, honestly, than what we would have usually done, because we were trying to get the project going, but really trying to assess, like, what can we take forward, what can't we take forward, and how could we expand this, but with the knowledge that every little universe that we want to take it to is completely different. We also didn't speak very much about Nepal, but of course there was a whole other set of experiences in Nepal. For a lot of the year, the schools were actually completely closed. So we had a lot of delays, and then they would open for a short time, close again. So it was quite a different experience there, but we didn't really have time to go into both today. So I just wanted to add that.
Thank you so much, Sarah. And we have a few questions coming in, and one of them builds on what you've just mentioned about your research taking place in 2 countries, and it's about generalizability. So we have a question from Professor Stefan Kolisho, who is asking whether you think the evidence from your project is context dependent, and to what extent it is generalizable, for instance, to schools in Wales and elsewhere.
Well, I mean, from my side, without knowing a huge amount about the schools in Wales and how programs function, I think a big issue is obviously the fact that we really need to actually use external facilitators to run these kinds of programs in South Africa and in Nepal as well. So in Nepal, it was run by basically a kind of category of student nurse that were attached to schools as school nurses. In South Africa, we would promote that it would be run by a kind of cadre of school counselors. They're not necessarily qualified as school counselors, but they're kind of psychosocial support workers. But I would think that in the high income settings where teachers are, I mean, maybe a slightly less under strain, or it's more acknowledged to be part of their job description that they engage in some level of psychosocial support, that it would be, this is definitely something that you'd be able to facilitate with teachers that would be able to facilitate, or other psychosocial support workers that would link to schools. So I think this is one of the things we're grappling with. On one hand, we understand that it's a little bit less scalable in our context, but on the other hand, if we were to rely entirely on teachers, the project wouldn't happen. And there's quite a well-known randomized controlled trials from India, but also, again, similar kind of socioeconomic context, where they did exactly the same school level intervention facilitated and implemented by teachers. And then they did it with school counselors, like this kind of community health worker, cadre worker. And it did work with the community health workers running it, but it didn't work when the teachers ran it. And I really think, the schools, particularly in South Africa, in the context that we know, are under massive strain. We have a lot of very serious systemic problems in our education system. So from our perspective, that wouldn't be possible to run it through with using teachers at this point anyway. Something I think that is generalizable everywhere, though, is definitely the focus on teacher well-being and burnout. So we believe that has been an important part of our project. Of course, we still need to we won't be able to examine the impact of that just yet, since this is still the feasibility trial. But I certainly think that if we're really serious about focusing on adolescent well-being, we need to think about the adults that are surrounding them as well, so caregivers and teachers in this case. So I certainly think that the findings around teacher well-being will be important across different contexts as well. We would have liked to have engaged caregivers more, as Tatenda mentioned. It was a bit beyond the scope of what we were trying to do. It's also difficult in our context. A lot of the time, the parents are really not involved at all with school, and it's even hard to get their contact details. But that is something that we will also think about more in future as well. I don't know if that answers all the questions, but let me know if I missed anything.
Thank you so much. I think this is really helpful, and I've just shared the links to a few of the things I think that you mentioned. I think perhaps you were talking about the Seher trial in India, and I think one of the rationales they had there, in addition to teachers being busy, and that has also been the case for a lot of sexual and reproductive health research, is this idea that sometimes teachers might also not be the best carriers of this type of health information, because they just have a different relationship, and often relationships are more didactic, and potentially it brings awareness about confidential issues, like the example Tatenda mentioned, that students would like to keep separate. So we have a question from Abby Rowe, also related to this issue of facilitation. We have a few questions that came through in the chat. And the question from Abby relates to the use of external facilitators and scalability, which I think you've already touched on. And I guess related question is whether you think that there is, whether if there were enough resources for teachers, enough time for teachers to deliver this, whether they would be well placed to do this. There is some ongoing research in Wales on the whole school mental health approach, which hopefully will have some insights into this that some of the colleagues in the center, in the Wolfson Centre, are working on as well. We also have a question from Dr. Faith Martin.
Sorry, Julia, do you mind if, I don't know if Tatenda maybe has a comment on the teacher,
Please.
just that aspect as well, since he's had a lot of experience working in schools across sexual and reproductive health and mental health projects, actually.
Thank you very much. I think working on both projects, one of the key themes is that teachers, they struggle with so many things. They've got too many things on their plate. So when you come in with a project, even though they might find it valuable, they almost have so much going on that they don't have the time to facilitate it. So they also advocate for external facilitators, and that's what I found in my limited experience working across two projects.
Thank you so much, Tatenda, and thanks for answering the other questions from attendees. The question we just got coming in from Dr. Faith Martin is about parental well-being. Any insights you might already have on parent well-being, particularly where children or young people have a mental health conditions, and the impact on the parent, and also situations where parents' mental health may be a risk factor for young people's mental health. If you have any insights from Hashtag or your other work on these wider systems.
Sure. So I suppose in the caregiver, we didn't focus on the Hashtag. In the work that we're doing for this caregiver support package, caregiver mental health is one of the kind of main components of it. And there's other quite good packages out there that have been tested in trials, particularly from War Child, which is an NGO that some of you may know of, where there's an intervention called the caregivers. I think might get it slightly wrong, but the caregiver skills intervention, where they focus on, it's particularly designed for humanitarian settings. They focus entirely on caregiver mental health first, and then they move on to the parenting skills second. So there are programs out there that do that, and it is something that we are working on for this age group at the moment. But that said, the program that we're working on is a universally delivered program. So this working off the assumption that, caregiving is an inherently wonderful yet stressful thing to be doing. So, trying to have something that's useful for all caregivers of children of this age group. In a separate project, we've just done, the WHO have been updating some of their guidelines again. We did a kind of evaluation of some existing reviews, and this again was for prevention programs, but one of the areas we looked at was around prevention of mental health problems in children, but aged 5 to 9, with a parent who has got a mental health condition. And we did find a really good review. There's only about 5 or 6 trials in the review, but a really high quality review. And I think that this is an area that is going to be getting more and more attention at this kind of global level, because there are a lot of platforms for, entry points for how to actually develop these kind of programs, particularly through the kind of adult mental health services, what could be done. So I think it's a new area. I think it's an area that I'm actually personally am very interested in. And I think there's a lot that will happen, but I'm not very aware of a lot of it happening at the global level just yet, basically.
Thank you. And I think that Tatenda,
thank you for finding the war child.
Tatenda mentioned also the challenge of which I think is very common in many settings, or probably everywhere to some extent, is of parents simply not having the bandwidth to be very involved in school, and potential challenge of reaching them through school-based programs. A question we had earlier on about the teacher modules is just about the availability of your materials. So could you let us know if anything is already available from hashtag, or if you expect any of the comics or other materials to be available online?
So the comics are online, and the teacher guide for those comics is online. If you just Google like Helping Adolescents Thrive comics, you'll find it, or teacher guide. The content that we use in hashtag is actually war child content. So we would need to, if someone wants to email me, I can find out about whether that's shareable yet or not. And we adapted it as well. So, we didn't use the full package. It's actually quite a long, involved package that they've got, and they've spent, really amazing formative work putting it together as well. So, and in terms of our intervention content, that's an excellent question about our actual groups. We haven't really thought about it yet. I think because we haven't, I'd be happy to share it kind of on a one-on-one level, but we haven't put it online or anything yet because it hasn't been fully tested. So, but I would be happy to share it if people are interested in just looking at it to see it.
Thank you very much. And I mean, it's also an interesting question, I suppose, for mental health interventions, because there are different views. On the one hand, there is a view of making everything open access to make sure it can reach as many people as possible. And I know some intervention teams are also concerned about how intervention materials are used and more hesitant about making everything openly available. So that's really good to know. I think I've shared the links from the WHO page to the comics, so hopefully that will give you some idea.
I don't think we have a policy on that yet, but I think we wouldn't be averse to sharing it, but I guess we're just with a big disclaimer on it of some kind. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm just checking if we have missed any questions. I think we've answered everything that has come in so far. So I think this is a call for any last questions. And in the meantime, Tatenda and Sarah, are there any comments, closing thoughts that you wanted to share?
Tatenda?
I think just for me, my parting thought would be, I think there is really space for this in schools. I think engaging with the teachers particularly, they found it very useful. And yeah, I think just to give an example, there was a time that we did some of the activities that we did in TT with the teachers. So for instance, mindfulness. And we went for one that was very neutral. It's something called My Favorite Place, where you envisage a favorite place and you basically go through that. And whilst doing that, in one of the teacher groups, two of the teachers actually broke down. And I think that just showed that just that space of being listened to is really, really appreciated. So yeah, I would strongly advocate if that can be considered on a larger scale. I think it would really help, because if we support the teachers, then hopefully they're also able then to support the adolescents.
Yeah, I guess thanks to Tatenda. From my side, I think I don't want this to sound negative, but my sort of parting thought, and something I've been thinking quite a lot recently, is that there's a lot of emphasis out there at the moment, I feel like, on schools-based programs, as I mentioned. And I've already discussed the universe idea and the fact that we need to be aware of the complexity of the logistics. But I think the other thing is that schools, particularly in a context like ours, can also be a real source of negative influence on mental health. We have high rates of violence and crime in schools in South Africa, for example. There's obviously issues with bullying, and it's, I think, quite a universal problem. And that if we are going to invest in school, think that schools can solve our problems and we can do universal interventions in school, we need to be able to provide sufficient levels of investment and support. We can't just assume that we hand over the package, even with the a few additional staff members to run it, and think that everything is going to be fine. So we really need to think quite carefully about the school environment and what's actually happening there. And I think it's really for us working in this area in Khayelitsha, Tatenda mentioned the issues with substance use. There's a massive problem with gangsterism and adolescent boys in particular being recruited from very young ages. Yeah, it's a very complex space, and I think we must be careful about thinking it's going to solve all our problems to run school-based programs, let's put it that way. But I hate to end on such a negative note, because I do think there's a massive amount of reach and potential, but just that we need to think carefully about how we implement those. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Tatenda and Sarah. So we focus on schools and also think about improving other sectors of society. We will, as we mentioned, post the recording of today's lecture on the YouTube channel of the center. Catherine has also shared the link in the chat where you can find, you'll be able to find this talk, but also previous lectures, and we will be back in early 2023 with the next talk in the series. So this is our last talk for 2022. Additional thanks for everybody for being here. I think no last minute burning questions have come in. So I think we'll close here. And thank you very much again for your time to our speakers and our attendees. Thank you for all the questions.
Great, thanks everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you, bye.